everyone. Welcome to episode 9 of season 4 of Performing the Arts. I know I always say that, but I like to always keep it fresh. Joining me today is a man of many hats. He's a wrestling producer, he is a podcaster, he's a web person for a website for MMA, he's a radio producer, he's voice. As I said, he's a lot of things. But his name is Matthew Ryan or Matt Ryan. No, he is not Constantine or the football player, the same name, just similar name. So yeah, Matt, I feel like we have a lot to discuss, mostly about. I know you from both with working with Catalyst Wrestling as a assistant there. So even though I'm not currently someone who does the shows there on location, I'm the person who usually writes up the shows and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Which I've been getting a lot more better over the past few months or so. But
oh, definitely, there's a noted improvement there. Has this turned into our quarterly review? Do I have to? I don't have any. I'll take the notes. My dog's on the side.
But in terms of entertainment, because I know you actually went to a former college of mine. I think you went to Kingsborough. Because I know you mentioned Kingsborough off and on, and I believe you worked at the radio station there. Maybe, I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, I worked at WKRB the entire time I was at Kingsborough. Yeah, I was there from the fall of 2007 all the way to when I graduated. I wore many hats there. I was a DJ, terrible DJ. I can hit the post, but I'm terrible as a music DJ. I was the news and sports director. I was the play-by-play announcer for Kingsborough basketball. Did some Brooklyn Cyclones commentating alongside my late friend Warner Fussell. I produced New York Islander hockey games on WKRB. It was a great experience. Yeah, Alyssa Nieves, now Rosenthaler, was my mentor there, as was Rob Herklotz, who was the general manager, and I still believe is the general manager of KRB. And I loved radio my entire life. Growing up in New York City, obviously WFAN was a huge presence in my life. K-Rock, Dime is Howard Stern. And then once I got into junior high school, I found Opie and Anthony.
Yeah.
And I found Ron and Fez. And it was revelatory. At that time, 12, 13 years old. And this is this is after Opie and Anthony get fired from WNEW. I heard about them for the first time reading the Daily News as an 11-year-old, because that's what 11-year-olds do, right? They read the newspaper, read the radio section. But I found out about Opie and Anthony, and I learned how to use Kazaa at the time, or LimeWire, or any of the other 97,000 variants of P2P software.
Yeah.
And Opie and Anthony clips would be everywhere. And Ron and Fez were on. I started listening to Ron and Fez before that, after Opie and Anthony got fired, and I was an instant convert. I would not do anything except for Raw or SmackDown. I do nothing on Monday through Friday nights between 7 and 11. I would just listen to Ron and Fez.
Yeah.
That. And then I ended up just in high school. I really wasn't a great student. I was pretty all over the place emotionally, because I was an angry white teenager with a lot of angst. The stereotype, the fat, angry kid who was spouting off at the mouth all the time. And I did not get into any of the colleges. And that's how I ended up at Kingsborough. I signed up because I knew they had a radio station, because they had a wrestling radio show in the late 90s that would end up airing on BCAT, which is the community access station in Brooklyn. Hold on.
Which is now BCAT is now because it's not really BCAT anymore. It's something along the lines of, it's like Brooklyn Public Access.
It's still a community access station.
It's not called BCAT anymore. It's something else. Yeah, which is sad, because BCAT also was one of the first things I actually saw, which was essentially underground wrestling around this.
Yes, WTF was on there.
Yes, Wrestling Outlaws, yes.
Yeah, and 2KW, which I ended up being a producer for so many years later. They were on MNN, Manhattan Neighborhood Network, but they were kind of the impetus for all of that.
Yeah, so it's odd how essentially, because I remember we used to have DirecTV for a long, long time, and after a while, DirecTV, it's just like it's like how many rainstorms can DirecTV not hold? Because by the time it's a rainstorm, it's like okay, rainstorm, we're not gonna have DirecTV for a while. But when we got like regular cable, it's like it's a rainstorm. The cable working now, so it's like so when we first got cable, I learned about the public access, and there was one night where I was like flipping through the channels and I came across like Beat Cap, like maybe 68, 69, around that area. And I just saw Wrestling Outlaws. I'm like, what is this WTF Wrestling Outlaws? And sure enough, it was like underground wrestling where it was like legitimately like you had people who were semi-trained or professionally trained, depending on how you saw it. Well, when being same age as you, close to same age as you, which was in, teenage, something like that, a year, where it's just like you're kind of like unable to differentiate what a professional athlete is and what people who are just doing like, backyard wrestling, even though this wasn't like underground backyard wrestling. This is like actual underground wrestling where it's like they're actually using like a warehouse to do their, and stuff like that. So yeah, it's weird how and of course, I actually went to some of the a couple of the shows because my brother actually knows the guy who actually ran the thing, so it's actually pretty fun.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So, and my brother will always say it's a legendary story for him because he's actually a wrestling person himself. He actually does. He actually did wrestling recaps, rant of the week, that sort of thing on LOP, that sort of thing, and he always joked that he sacrificed his toe for the business because because the show itself was in Queens and we live out in Brooklyn. So going to Brooklyn and to Queens is a long story by itself because you got to do so many different things. And of course, we had to jump from both the train to the bus, and just taking the right bus on a Queens bound bus is a little hard. So by the time he got to the thing, his foot was like hurting. So he had to essentially get like a toe operation or something like that to take out like a toenail or something like that because like his. So he always jokes every now and then. I sacrificed my foot for the business, like an actual toe for the business, because it's he tells them more better in his own. I always
that's the thing with telling other people's stories, which is kind of my job, is you always have to figure out if that person whose story you're telling.
Folks, technical difficulties. The technical difficulties of owning an animal. So
dog difficulties. She got a little vomity, but now she's with her mother and she's all cool. It's the perils of owning a
dog. So yeah, BCAT was one of those things that actually helped me understand what actual wrestling was. Well, not wrestling was, but a taste of small independent wrestling, or at least underground wrestling to that effect. And you mentioned before that Kingsborough Radio actually had a wrestling radio show.
Yeah, it had one when I was 10. So this is like 99, 2000. So 7, 8 years later, I hosted my own wrestling radio show on there, and gave me great opportunities to interview people, get a better understanding of the industry, and kind of formulate my own identity of who I am, what kind of show I want to do as a performer, and kind of learning how to produce. And then I started doing a sports show with Dr. Marvin Williams, who was a professor of mine at the time. And, we've been friends, for over a decade now at this point.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Hang on. Marvin Williams, does he do music?
Yeah.
Music? I know. I took him.
Yeah, he was a great professor, and he and I we had a friendship that we were in a mass communications class. It was my either my second semester of my freshman year or the first of my sophomore year. It gets muddied, but I took his class. I wrote a 40-page paper that could have been a 12-page paper about wrestling on television. And from there, we did a sports show together, and we've been friends and partners in broadcasting ever since then. And it's been one of the most valuable relationships of my professional and personal life.
Yeah, I clearly remember having class it might have been the same class, but I'm not sure if it was in the same semester because uh, I'm pretty sure if we both had class together at Kingsborough, because I was at Kingsborough from like 2005 to 2008 or so, like the fall of 2008. I didn't graduate there because of, and I remember clearly having Professor Williams's class and also being friends with him for the most part because I would go to his office and we would just have like friendly conversations about that stuff. You know, I would always joke the fact that he had a Janet Jackson picture in his office, and I always look, don't touch my Janet, that sort of thing too. So, and he would always laugh about that, and yeah, I remember him actually being a very cool professor, and he graciously allowed me to do, I believe, a, not play, a video game esque thing that took place on Kingsborough, but had the uh, background of maybe Red Dawn. So it was like, and he actually like loved the idea of a free roaming game. Well, now it would be called a free roaming open world game, where it's just like, oh, you're in an area of, say, Brooklyn or maybe even Chicago or
Like
what.
GTA.
Yeah, like GTA, where it's just like you're basically going around and helping people, all that stuff, trying to defeat, terrorists or something like that. It's basically like Red Dawn in Brooklyn or something like that. Even though they've actually made Red Dawn in Brooklyn more than 3 years ago, called Bushwick with Dave Bautista, which is a good movie. So yeah, although not really like Red Dawn in Brooklyn, it's more something along the lines like that, but it's different. Uh, anyway, I get into long tractions. I'm sorry again. So yeah, it's weird how. And I know you mentioned the general manager too, because I've actually worked at the news station for at least maybe a semester or something like that, because I was like an off and on person that actually did that, that tried my hand at the semester at the radio station there, because it wasn't work study, but it was definitely student related stuff. Whereas it's like, because I had like, I believe a show, not a show, I believe I had a radio class or something like that, or we may have had a class.
Yeah, Rob or Cliff Hesse would have been the professors for that. Like, they did have radio classes. They actually teach classes now in the radio station. Like, they completely renovated the radio station not long after I left, and they completely like gutted it. All the studios are different now. Like, it feels nice and modern. When I was working at KRB, it was 3 studios, all covered in like dirt brown soundproof.
Yeah.
And it was
like grayish colors.
Yeah. And the boards they worked, but buttons were missing or things would pop off. Potentiometers were off a cock. I loved it because it was my first board. It was a huge contrast to when I worked at WRHU when I went to Hofstra for 15 minutes. But it was great education and opened the doors for a ton of opportunities that help me now over a decade later.
Yeah. So, and I do want to bring this up to a point where we are talking about radio. And I know there is the idea of both FM, AM radio, which is the normal radio, versus online radio / streaming radio, whereas it's like Sirius XM, where people you just mentioned before, where Opie and Anthony had their own channel, Howard Stern his own channel, Ron and Fez, I think they probably had their own channel still. I'm not
sure. They were on the Opie and Anthony channel.
Yeah. So anybody who you mentioned before, aside from Howard Stern, because Howard Stern has his own private channel, they usually essentially connected to on their own channel on, like, I think Sirius XM. So compared to FM / AM radio, normal radio, compared to online radio slash streaming radio, do you see like regular radio like essentially slowly like slowly fizzling away? Because even though radio is radio, radio can never die because it's still radio. Even if TV or something like that goes out of the thing, if you have if you have a ham radio, that's still a radio, and people can still listen to the thing because people still do ham radio stations. If you go to like the low end of a dial, you might get a faint of someone playing music from their ham radio. So it's like, radio can never die because it's radio waves. So as long as you have like a thing, but in terms of traditional radio, is traditional radio still good, or will it have like a resurgence because of people? I mean, because of streaming sites like with streaming radio, it's like there's not that many places you could do with streaming radio. There's only like maybe a couple of streaming radio sites compared to like if you want to watch movies, there's a lot of choices if you want to watch movies. But when
I'm going to cut you off, but when it comes to traditional radio, when it comes to terrestrial broadcasting, the FM AM system, the concept still, as you said, radio is always going to exist. Radio as a viable industry now is solely reliant on music and conservative talk stations. Conservative talk stations are the lifeblood of a lot of the major radio platforms, whether they're Cumulus Radio, whether they're iHeart. Shows like The Breakfast Club carry iHeart hard because it's one of the few things on that platform that they syndicate. Everything's predicated on syndication now. About 15 years ago, they really made a push for live and local on a lot of radio stations because it was predicated on community, those people in your town, but it was all cookie cutter. It was all the same shows, all the same mentality. Ever since the Janet Jackson incident, speaking of Janet Jackson, back in the Super Bowl 2004 or 2003 even, when that moment happened and the backlash of that is the reason why Howard Stern went to Sirius, why Opie and Anthony went to XM Satellite Radio, is because the restrictions became so financially, it was a financial deterrent for CBS Radio or Westwood One at the time, or a Clear Channel, who were getting rid of Howard Stern across multiple platforms. And he decided to make the jump, not only because they were going to pay him an ungodly amount of money, but because not only could he say the 7 dirty words there, he could say the same things he was saying 2 to 3 years before that, or a decade prior to that, if he wanted to. People who thrive on radio now are conservative talk show hosts. They're Rush Limbaugh, they're Tucker Carlson, they're Sean Hannity. They've risen up from different small market stations to being syndicated to getting their own national platforms through syndication and cable television. So there's always going to be that there. There's always going to be those different things. We're not going to see the zenith of a Scott Shannon. We're not going to see Scott Shannon or a Howard Stern. We're not going to see great innovators on terrestrial radio anymore because everything's become so segmented, become so manufactured and so pasteurized that there's no one really willing to take a chance on the platform because it's all about just keeping the lights on at this point. iHeart is one of the biggest media conglomerates in the world, especially when it comes to radio. And they've had to file for different levels of bankruptcy because their outdoor advertising business was what kept them in business, but they were draining hundreds of millions of dollars in radio.
So, as you just said before, radio can never go away. It's just more along the lines of what type of radio will be more financially better. With terrestrial radio, as you just said before, there is a push for conservative radio stations like practically like 710, 770. I may be wrong on the.
No, WABC is certainly a conservative station. WOR, I think, is more middle of the road. I haven't listened to WOR in years, but I know John Gambling was fairly conservative. I outside of the Mets, I don't know what's on WOR anymore. But to talk about like streaming radio, there are major players. There's Apple, there's Spotify, There's so many different podcast platforms now. Joe Rogan's getting paid hundreds of millions of dollars to put his podcast on Spotify.
Yeah.
Joe Budden from Jersey City turned his podcast into a multi-million-dollar industry. The guy who was only known for one song turned his entire career around by having a podcast. Right now, more than ever, there are opportunities for people.
Yeah.
It's
especially because of what's happened for the past year. Yeah, for the past year or so with the coronavirus and stuff like that, where people are more locked in their house, or at least more lockdown, or at least limited to certain functions. Where it's like, and this is definitely I want to bring up something later, which is wrestling and the coronavirus. There wrestlers, they were using third-party platforms like Twitch and Vimeo in order to, get their essentially springboard into other, factors of doing stuff, podcasts as well. So it's definitely because of what happened within the past year or so. There are people who are having a lot more opportunity to do stuff like this, podcasting, or even something like Twitch, just stream on Twitch, maybe 4 or 5 hours of just playing, say, like GTA or Red Dead Redemption or Among Us or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
People watch because people are enjoying the fact that these people who are streaming, they're having fun, they're very chatty, and they're doing stuff with this stuff, and they're engaging with the audience and stuff like that too. And not only that, they are building a fan base with that platform. So yeah, it's definitely, there are definitely opportunities now compared to where, say, 15 years ago, where the only opportunities were probably in mainstream TV or YouTube, where it was just slow. 15 years ago, YouTube wasn't even a big thing yet, or even
I think it was barely online.
15 years. The only times you would have to get something on to watch something like a video of, say, again, wrestling, where it's my brother would have dozens of, or not dozens, but hundreds of wrestling clips that he got from those streaming sites that you just mentioned before, like LimeWire, never really used it. And of course, we would have to use Winamp, Windows Media Player, Real Player, things that are probably still around, but people don't really use anymore, because nowadays, if you need to host a video, you go to YouTube or Videomo or Spotify if you want to just host the audio stuff like that. So yeah, definitely more opportunities to get your brand out. So yeah, and of course, I think because and for the past year or so, people have becoming a lot more invested in other sorts of brands because of what's been happening.
Yeah.
So yeah, I definitely do agree that radio cannot die, because radio is radio, because it's radio probably even in Fallout, right, where it's it's after the end, it's a couple of hundred years after the internal apocalypse and stuff like that. There's still radio. There's still people playing the Odie stations for some reason. There's never any music that relates to, say, I know it's part of the aesthetic of the Fallout thing, where it's there's no modern music, but there's someone who's found a radio station and is broadcasting music. So yeah. So even if there is an apocalypse where it's just things are that bad, there's someone probably got to be at a radio station. It's being another last DJ, where it's just well, there is no FCC to bug me, so I could easily just play whatever I wanted and without the repercussions. But that's a whole different story. Yeah, I'm sorry, folks, for going to Espiel. But I did mention wrestling before, and you mentioned wrestling. I mean, more than a few things. You are one of the main producers of Catalyst Wrestling.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you come up into that venture of not only getting into wrestling, but also just being a wrestling producer and stuff like that too?
So I got into the wrestling industry because of radio. I was doing a radio show and then I did a couple of podcasts, and through that I made friends in the wrestling industry. And I would do commentary on shows. They would let me sit in for a match or two, and I loved commentary. Always wanted to do commentary, like going back to when I was a kid. Huge fan of Gorilla Monsoon. Huge fan of Jim Ross. Was a big Joey Styles fan. I loved ECW, that energy of ECW. And throughout that time, like just doing commentary, making connections, you would end up, getting opportunities. I got to, work for a couple of New York based air promotions. And that led me when I was working for a company called Fighting Spirit Wrestling based out of Sunset Park. They hired me as an announcer, and then I was like, hey, I have some ideas, and then I ended up producing matches, helping come up with storylines, really kind of just learning. And then after that, I was able to work during that time too. I was working with Ring of Honor.
Oh,
When I was at
nice.
Ring of Honor, I was an intern. Like I was
Yeah.
essentially just an unpaid assistant who would learn. I took in things. I would go to shows. I would go to TV tapings. I'd be a runner. I would get people's stuff. I would watch interviews. I would see how they format the show. I would
Yeah.
try to learn as much as I can. And I made a great friend in Dan Bynum, who's a consulting producer for Catalyst Now, who was the director for World Class Championship Wrestling, was the director of the Bad Street USA video.
Oh my God, that is amazing.
Yeah, I've known Dan almost a decade at this point, and he's been one of the best. He's a great cheerleader, a great coach, a great mentor. He can tell you, and he's got great stories. Obviously, he worked in WCW. We connected in Ring of Honor. We worked together when we were both with MLW. Dan is a great guy, and learning under them, I just kept building up a base, and then I started becoming a performer. My character was Matthew Ryan Shapiro. I literally became Matthew Ryan Shapiro because I was up in Canada for a benefit show that a company I was working with at the time and had a good relationship with. I was going to do commentary for one of the matches, and I think I was also going to do interviews, and I brought a suit.
Hmm.
The promoter of C4 Wrestling, Mark Polisel, said, hey, Matt, you have a suit with you, right? I'm like, yes, I have a suit. Do you want to manage tonight? I need a lawyer for Twiggy, who was the top heel at the time, who was doing an Andy Kaufman character. He would only wrestle women. And I'm like, in the back of my head, remembering when I watched the Andy Kaufman movie, I'm from Hollywood, on Comedy Central, in my mother's friend's house at 2:00 in the morning on Comedy Central. And that memory has stuck with me to this day. And like, Andy Kaufman to me is one of the greatest, if not the greatest professional wrestling character of all time, because he was able to subvert the art form. He was able to subvert all of Hollywood, get people to buy in on this, and commit so much to the bit, to the gimmick, that it transcended wrestling. It's a pop culture staple at this point. And it was one of the early defining things of David Letterman's time on NBC with the late night show. It was about a year or two into the late night show. And that as a wrestling fan is some of the most important stuff. So from there, I became a manager. I did a couple of shots in Canada, couldn't go every show. But then a couple of people I worked with at FSW called me up, asked me to work on a show with them. Cut to a few weeks later, I'm now the booker of that company. And that was in 2014. And that was around this time. Actually, I think it's coming up this week, the anniversary of that show. Less said about that show, the better. But then a little while after that, I ended up working with 2KW Pro when 2KW came back. And that kind of led me up to Catalyst.
That is amazing. Because in New York, it's like it's weird because in New York City, or at least in the tri-state area, well, I'll just say in both Jersey and uh, New York State. I mean, there is wrestling in Connecticut, but when you think wrestling in Connecticut, we all know what we're talking about, which is the WWE. So it's like anything you hear in Connecticut, it's like it's kind of hard to think about wrestling in Connecticut when it's just like, oh, it's just WWE, you know, it's in Connecticut. But in both Jersey and New York, and especially in Philadelphia, I mean in Pennsylvania, there are a lot of promotions on just on the grounds alone. In New York alone, I remember going, you know, my Facebook memories just like literally just posted just last night was me going to my first and only Evolved show because my first and only Evolved show was just at least 2 blocks away at my at the Saint my Catholic church, which was the Saint Finbarr's Catholic Church. So
Mhm.
you know, I managed to see a lot of these wrestlers before they went on to the WWE. You know, uh, and AEW, where you know I saw Eddie Kingston that night. I saw Priscilla Kelly. I saw the Street Profits. I saw Kobe Carino, who is your champion at Catalyst Wrestling, playing a great heel. So it's odd to actually and it's odd to actually see him playing a heel and all of a sudden watching him on Catalyst Wrestling, seeing almost like a switch from being both a heel and a face. Just like it's amazing. And other you know promotions too. I was gonna go to the last Evolve show last year, but I was working at the time, so I couldn't make the show because you know it's when you're working, it's like you can't really make the schedule when you want wrestling unless it's like wrestling happens to be at during like an open area during like a day when you're not working. It's like oh okay, I'm not working that day. Let's go see some wrestling. But yeah, when it comes to wrestling in New York, there's like a lot of places. There was Evolved I just mentioned. There's Ring of Honor, even though they're traditionally a more probably Philadelphia thing, but they're
Oh,
more
Ring of Honor's got a strong history in New York.
yeah. It has a strong history in New York. MLW I know it used to run in New York, but now it runs down in Florida.
It started in New York and Philly. Did shows in Florida, and then when they came back, they've done New York, they've done Philly, they've done a lot of stuff in the Tampa Orlando area too.
Yeah, which is more like I think because of what it's been. And again, this is something I want to touch upon in a little while with the coronavirus. It's like Florida is like the only type of area that's allowing to do like wrestling sports as opposed
Mhm.
to anywhere else. It's like, oh, you can do wrestling stuff. It's like you just can't have like crowds and stuff.
Yeah.
And that's a question I want to save in a little while. Uh, but with Jersey, it's like there's a lot of places in Jersey that you kind of like know of. There's
Mhm.
like Jersey All Pro Wrestling, which was like the almost like the 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 second ECW without saying it was like ECW because it was following after the footsteps of ECW around the time. But Jersey All Pro was also something that was
Oh.
still around before and after ECW. So it was like
Mhm.
that sort of thing. And
Yeah.
and it's like when you think of wrestling in the tri-state area, New York and Jersey, or at least in the upper East Coast area, New York and Jersey has like a very stronghold of like a lot of promotions that you go, okay, you know, I know that, you know, I know that promotion because a lot of the wrestlers who I follow happen to be workers of that promotion. Uh, you know, Homicide, when you're one of the one of the great Catalyst wrestlers, he works a lot of the promotions, not only in New York but also Jersey,
Hmm.
that sort of thing. Uh, HC Loke, who is another wrestler at Callis, he's also a streamer wrestler. He worked in ECW. So it's like a lot of people who you know, especially if they're on, if especially if it's like a small promotion or at least smallest promotion, chances are you might know a couple of those wrestlers because you've seen those wrestlers at other promotions because of how the way wrestling is in New York and Jersey and Philadelphia, and especially in essentially in the East Coast.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned before, and this is something I want to bring up now, which is, I mean, well, actually, hang on. I'll say that question for next, but this is a question that I do want to ask you now, which is character wise, staying in character. And you mentioned Andy Kaufman, and Andy Kaufman is a great influence of someone who never seemed to be in or out of character because you never really could understand Andy Kaufman unless you really knew him personally. When you saw him out in public, you wasn't sure if this was Andy Kaufman playing a character or if this was just him himself. So it's like it was weird, and it's weird to be a 50-50 with Andy Kaufman, but when he was in wrestling, he was like one of the greatest heels to see as someone who wasn't really a professional wrestler. He was less again. Kaufman was a non-professional wrestler, but he really could make people entertain because he was doing the whole he-man woman hater gimmick, where he was just basically against women and he was fighting women, all that stuff too. Now, when it comes to characters, especially in this day and age, where you know someone personally, and there's also the advantages of social media, how hard is it for the wrestler to stay in character compared when people know them personally, you know, where there's like, oh, I know that wrestler. They share funny memes on their, you know, on their personal accounts and stuff like that, compared to when they're supposed to like this when you know when they're supposed to be like this very evil accountant, like you know IRS, who is always like trying to get them money or something like that, or something like that. It's like, is it hard now to keep a character in motion when social media is a great influence of actually not only springboarding that character, but also just being also a watchful eye for people to actually be like, and this is something I mentioned before, which is essentially Twitch, where it's like they have this platform to actually be themselves without really being themselves. If you
Yeah,
understand.
yeah, no, it's a duality. As professional wrestling evolves as a sport, evolves as an industry, it evolves with the times. It evolves and adapts to where we are in the world. And social media has been a great tool and a great deterrent for certain people in pro wrestling. It gives you the opportunity to work on your character, provide supplementary content, whether it's videos, photos, memes, or just text based assets. And it allows you to show your full side. And then there are certain people who utilize social media completely out of character and show the personality behind the gimmick, as it were, to build up their brand. And then there are people like Darius Carter who whose commitment to their character, to their persona, extends into social media and how they operate within the world of professional wrestling and how they live within and without of it. Darius understands that way better than a lot of people would probably want to give him credit for, because Darius is a derisive figure,
Yeah,
uh, because he's Darius. Like
yeah,
that is what you see is what you get from Darius Carter, and that is a great asset for a producer because that allows you to integrate social media into your storylines. That allows you to build up a presence. A guy like Casey Navarro, who utilizes his Instagram Live to connect with fans, to build a personality. He's cocky, he's confident, and he understands the landscape. The kid's 21 years old. He was the Sapphire Television champion when he could not get into the club that was named after the belt he held. But guys like them, guys like Jordan Oliver, Anthony Gangone, Mike Law, a lot of guys on the Catalyst roster know how to utilize social media. A guy like RJ City turns social media into a huge weapon. Effie, a litany of guys. Social media has given so many people the opportunity not only to grow their brand, but to create a brand. A good friend
yeah.
of mine, Hokai, is the guy you go to when you want your show gift and put out on the internet because he has a great eye for it and he knows how to utilize these platforms. social media can be a beautiful tool for professional wrestling, or it could be the situation where you let your guard down completely, you utilize as much of your clout as possible, and then people kind of see behind that, and you create this paper thin veil, and you may express an opinion that people may not like. And then from there, it goes down and down and down and down.
Yeah, it's sort of like what I was just talking last episode, which was essentially the cancel culture of canceling someone because of comments they may have made in the past, even though they might have not made it in personal taste, or maybe they just made it in a joke, that sort of thing. So, and uh, and wrestling had their own version of not cancel culture, but their own version of speaking out, which was actually people who were essentially pissed off at certain people over not only of their own transgressions, but also just people who were blackballed, and people who were well, not wrongfully accused, but people who were not. Let me rephrase that. People who were people who were wrongfully accused by people who were essentially accusing them from different things. Essentially, it's essentially he said she said thing, but when in actuality she was actually right as opposed to he was actually right. So it was more along the lines of them using their clout, i.e., their power, to make it appear like they were in the right as opposed to them being actually in the wrong. So the victim could actually be more. I mean, so they could play the victim as opposed to the victim themselves, if that makes sense. So it's definitely it's definitely a dangerous weapon now, where it's like there are wrestlers like the MJFs where it's like you don't know if he's really playing a character, or if he's actually like that character, because it's like that sort of thing where it's like you just can't seem and it's something like you just said before, where it's like that dual quality thing where it's like you can't really see where that character begins and when the character ends, when the real person begins and when that real person ends. And it's the same thing with acting, where it's just like once you go on stage, it's just like okay, once you go on stage, that character begins, and when you go off stage, that character ends. So it's sort of like the same thing with wrestling, where it's just like the moment you go on in the ring, that character ends, and the moment you go outside the ring, or if you're on the camera or doing a promo, that's when the character starts. But the moment you're like done for the night, that's when the character just ends, and you can just go back to yourself. So, but I do think that, and I do agree that there are wrestlers who actually get more mainstream exposure because of their social media. And and you mentioned a few wrestlers who work for Catalyst: Anthony Gangone, uh, Casey Navarro, and a few others. They recently just got on to not only AEW but also Impact.
Mm-hmm.
As a person who has seen and this is a great question to ask too, but as a person who has essentially seen their rise as a wrestler, how is it essentially seeing them from where they were originally, or at least when they were like essentially rookies or what have you, when in their first year, to where they are now, where they could easily just be on AEW Dark and showing that, hey, there are great wrestlers that are essentially not being able to see regularly, because they don't have they're not able to essentially use that clout, so to speak, as what you said before.
It's great to see guys like KC, Australian Suicide, who worked for us, who's El Austranelio in AEW, Anthony Bowens, who worked for Catalyst, is in AEW, Proud and Powerful, who I worked with while at House of Glory and at 2KW and Fighting Spirit Wrestling when they were EYFBO. I worked with those guys for a very long time, and to see them make that step. Sonny Kiss, who was a former Catalyst champion, Nyla Rose, who is at the upper echelon. And then you've got guys like Joe Keys and Ken Dixon, Eric Martin, O'Shea Edwards, who are doing great things in Ring of Honor, some of which were on the Catalyst roster, some of which are on the Catalyst roster now. it's for me as a fan of the industry, it's a great thing. As a producer, it makes me feel very proud. It also has me scrambling, just in case, when it's not an if, it's a when these guys get signed to major deals. Who's next up? Who are the next crop of professional wrestlers that are ready to make a name for themselves, ready to make a statement, ready to grow and develop with us as we head into our fourth year.
Yeah.
January 1st, we announced the company in 2017. And then 4 years later, we are still in business and running shows in the middle of a fakakta pandemic.